I still remember the exact moment everything went sideways with my HOA president. It was 7:45 on a Tuesday morning when I first saw Margaret Petton standing in my driveway, hands on her hips, staring at my John Deere like it had personally offended her entire bloodline. The morning dew hadn't even dried on my grass yet. But there she was, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tight they could crack walnuts. "That thing," she said, pointing at my tractor with the kind of disgust usually reserved for roadkill, "is in violation of Section 12.3 of the Maple Ridge Estates Covenant." I took a slow sip of my coffee and adjusted my cap. At 58 years old, I'd dealt with my share of difficult people, but Margaret was in a league of her own. She'd been HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd turned our quiet neighborhood into her personal kingdom. "Morning to you too, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice level. "And what exactly is wrong with my tractor?" She flipped through her clipboard dramatically, even though we both knew she had every single rule memorized. "Agricultural equipment must be stored in an enclosed structure when not in active use. Your machine has been visible from the street for 17 minutes. I glanced at my watch. "Actually, it's been 16 minutes. I just drove it out of the garage to load some mulch." Her eye twitched. That was her tell when someone challenged her authority. "Regardless, you're in violation. I'll be issuing a formal warning." She scribbled furiously on her clipboard, tore off a pink slip, and thrust it at me. That was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret escalated her campaign against my tractor with the determination of a general planning a siege. She filed complaints about excessive engine noise when I started it up at 8 a.m., well within the allowed hours. She measured my tire tracks in the grass and claimed they exceeded the acceptable turf depression depth outlined in Section 8.7. She even tried to argue that my tractor's green paint clashed with the neighborhood's cohesive aesthetic palette. The situation reached new heights of absurdity when she hired a surveyor to determine if my tractor's parking spot encroached on the common area by 3 inches. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But that didn't stop her from calling an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she called the ongoing agricultural crisis threatening our property values. I attended that meeting, sitting in the back row of the community center while Margaret presented a 45-minute PowerPoint about the dangers of unregulated farm equipment in residential zones. She had graphs. She had statistics about tractor-related incidents from 1997. She even had a slide showing my tractor with a big red X through it. "This isn't just about one tractor," she declared, clicking to a slide that showed a dystopian future where our neighborhood was overrun with combines and hay balers. "This is about maintaining the standards that make Maple Ridge Estates a premier residential community." Half the room was asleep. The other half was checking their phones. But Margaret pressed on, outlining her proposed tractor prohibition amendment that would ban all agricultural equipment except push mowers. That's when I raised my hand. "Margaret, I use that tractor to maintain the community garden plots. You know, the ones the HOA voted to establish last year." Her face turned the color of an overripe tomato. "That's irrelevant. You can use a wheelbarrow like everyone else." "A wheelbarrow won't haul 800 pounds of compost," I pointed out. "Then make multiple trips," she snapped. The meeting ended without a vote, but Margaret wasn't done. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door about noise pollution and visual contamination. She organized a petition that garnered a whopping 3 signatures, including her own, her husband Harold's, and someone who later admitted they thought they were signing up for a newsletter about actual tractors. Then came the Rose Garden incident. Margaret had spent thousands of dollars installing what she called a botanical masterpiece along her property line. It was 20 feet of hybrid tea roses, each one labeled with a little brass plaque bearing names like Queen Elizabeth and Mr. Lincoln. She gave tours. She entered them in competitions. She talked to them every morning while wearing white gloves. The problem was, her masterpiece extended 18 inches onto the public easement, right where I needed to drive my tractor to access the community garden. I'd mentioned this to her politely several times, but she insisted the easement was more of a suggestion than a rule. That Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after our first confrontation, I needed to deliver a load of fresh topsoil to the garden. Margaret must have been watching from her window because as soon as I started my tractor, she came rushing out in her bathrobe and garden clogs. "Don't you dare," she shrieked, positioning herself directly in front of my tractor. "You are not driving that monstrosity past my roses." I turned off the engine and took a deep breath. "Margaret, your roses are on public property. I've asked you nicely to move them. I've shown you the property survey. I need to get through." "Over my dead body," she declared, spreading her arms wide like she was protecting her children from a charging rhino. "These roses have been featured in Garden Gorgeous magazine. They're worth more than your rusty bucket of bolts." My John Deere wasn't rusty. I kept it in pristine condition. But I held my tongue. "Margaret, please move. I have volunteers waiting at the garden." "Then they can keep waiting," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police. This is harassment. This is intimidation. This is agricultural terrorism." I sat there for a full 5 minutes while she ranted into her phone at what I'm pretty sure was a very confused 911 dispatcher. Meanwhile, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, some with coffee mugs, others with phones out, recording. Finally, I'd had enough. I started the engine again. "Last chance, Margaret. Move, or your roses are going to become mulch." Her eyes went wide. "You wouldn't dare." I put the tractor in gear and let it creep forward at approximately 1 mile per hour. Margaret held her ground for about 3 seconds before diving dramatically to the side, screaming about attempted vehicular homicide. The roses, unfortunately, were not as nimble. I drove straight through them, the sound of crunching stems and rustling leaves filling the morning air. 20 feet of Queen Elizabeth and Mr. Lincoln became organic matter under my tires. Margaret's screams could probably be heard 3 blocks away. "My babies! He murdered my babies!" She was on her knees in the dirt, cradling a decapitated rose bloom. "Harold, call 911. Call the FBI. Call the National Guard." The police did arrive, 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret met them at the curb, still in her bathrobe, mascara running down her cheeks, holding rose petals like evidence at a crime scene. "Officers, arrest this man. He's destroyed private property. He tried to run me over. He's a menace to society." Officer Chen, a young woman who clearly had dealt with Margaret before, pulled out a notepad. "Ma'am, can you explain what happened?" Margaret launched into a theatrical retelling that involved me revving my engine like a madman and charging at her with murderous intent. She claimed I'd been planning this attack for weeks, that I'd been casing her rose garden, that I was probably part of some anti-rose conspiracy. Then Officer Chen turned to me. "Sir, your side of the story." I pulled out my phone and showed her the video I'd been recording. Yes, I'd been filming the whole thing. When you deal with someone like Margaret, you learn to document everything. The video clearly showed Margaret refusing to move from public property, me giving her multiple warnings, and her dramatic dive that would have made a soccer player proud. "Ma'am," Officer Chen said slowly, "it appears your roses were planted on the public easement." "So?" Margaret snapped. "That doesn't give him the right to destroy them." "Actually," the officer continued, "it does, and blocking access to public property is a misdemeanor. You could be cited for that." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But my roses. They should have been planted on your property," Officer Chen said. "Sir, are you planning to press charges for blocking public access?" I thought about it for a moment while Margaret held her breath. "No, officer. I think she's learned her lesson." But Margaret hadn't learned anything. Over the next week, she filed complaints with everyone she could think of, the city council, the county commissioner, the State Department of Agriculture. She even wrote to our congressman about what she called the tragic destruction of American beauty by rogue tractor operators. The HOA board, tired of her antics and worried about potential lawsuits, called a special meeting. This time, it wasn't about my tractor. It was about Margaret. The board president, a retired attorney named Robert Sinclair, didn't mince words. "Margaret, your actions have exposed the HOA to significant liability. Planting on public property, harassing residents, making false police reports, this has to stop." Margaret stood up, clutching her latest 3-ring binder full of evidence against me. "I'm protecting our property values. I'm maintaining standards. Someone has to stand up to the chaos. The only chaos," Robert said, "is what you're creating. We've received 17 complaints about your behavior in the last month alone. Those are from people who don't understand what it takes to run a proper community," Margaret protested. "They're from people who are tired of living in a police state," another board member chimed in. The vote was swift and unanimous. Margaret was removed as HOA president and banned from holding any HOA position for 5 years. The look on her face when the results were announced was a mixture of shock, rage, and disbelief. "You can't do this. I've given my life to this community. I've sacrificed everything." "Your sacrifice is noted and no longer needed," Robert said dryly. As a final insult to Margaret's injury, the board voted to reimburse me for $300 in legal fees I'd incurred responding to her various complaints. They also passed a resolution thanking me for maintaining the community garden and officially designating the easement as a tractor-accessible route. Margaret tried to speak again, but Robert gavelled the meeting closed. She stood there for a moment, looking around the room at her former subjects, who were already getting up to leave, completely ignoring her. Then came the final blow. The city attorney, who'd been invited to the meeting, approached Margaret with an envelope. "Mrs. Peton, this is a citation for destruction of public property and creating a public nuisance. The fine is $1,500. Margaret's face went from red to purple to a shade of white I'd never seen on a living person. $1,500. For what?" "For repeatedly planting on public property after being warned and for filing false reports," the attorney said. "You can contest it in court, but I should warn you that the video evidence is quite compelling." She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a fury that could have melted steel. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll get you for this." But it was over. The next day, a crew arrived to remove what was left of her rose garden from the easement. Margaret watched from her window, occasionally coming out to yell at the workers, but they'd been warned about her and just kept working. Within a month, Margaret and Harold had put their house on the market. The last time I saw her, she was directing movers with the same intensity she'd once reserved for HOA violations. She didn't look at me, but I could see her shoulders tense when my tractor rumbled past. They moved to a condo complex 2 towns over. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to get on their HOA board but was rejected when they did a background check and found the legal citations. The community garden has never looked better. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I drive my tractor down that easement, delivering compost and mulch to grateful gardeners. Sometimes I think about Margaret and wonder if she's found new roses to obsess over, new rules to enforce, new neighbors to terrorize. Then I remember the $1,500 fine and the look of utter defeat on her face when she realized her reign of terror was over.